Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's my very particular pleasure this evening to welcome you to the LJS, homeborn and guests, and in particular our two speakers, Professor Jeffrey Alderman and Pam Fox, author of Isidor Mattuck, Architect of Liberal Judaism. Today is not only the launch of this significant biography, but a reminder that Mattuck was a hugely influential religious figure within this congregation of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. For Liberal Judaism, and delighted to see Chairman of Liberal Judaism, Lucien Hudson, which was of course then called the Jewish Religious Union, and he was a significant figure nationally. This is the first major biography of this community's first appointed rabbi, and Pam Fox, who wrote the centenary volume for this synagogue, a book which I think is also on sale today, A Place to Call My Jewish Home, in 2011. With her background in local government, leadership development, and change management, is well placed not only to understand the nature of the man she has written about, but also the sense of mission and the passion he brought to his leadership at the LJS, a mission he carried out with charisma, learning, courage, and single-minded determination. Pam, among her many achievements, is a visiting fellow at Liabeck College. She has written extensively and was awarded a prestigious month-long fellowship by the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati in May 2014. I understand that her next project is a full-length study of the Jews of Golders Green. It will certainly be a weighty tome, over 40 synagogues or shtiebels and 50 kosher eateries to write about. You're looking forward to it. Professor Alderman, whom we also welcome here this evening, is an academic and journalist, and is particularly well known to the reading public of the Jewish Chronicle, or, if I may say, Professor Alderman, your sharp-edged weekly column, in which it is not unknown for you to take the odd swipe against liberal Judaism. We are honoured that you have agreed to interview Pam this evening, and I'm sure that it is a tribute to Pam's scholarship and research about Israel Mattuck that you are here today. Professor Alderman, whose teachers were Sir Martin Gilbert, the late A.J.P. Taylor, and the late Dr. Cecil Roth, is Michael Cross, Professor of Politics and Contemporary History, specialising in modern British and European history and British and American politics at the University of Buckingham, where he has lectured and taught since 2007. He has held numerous and eminent academic posts, including at Touro College, New York, and at the American Intercontinental University, London, and currently holds a number of visiting and emeritus professorial titles, including guest professor at Ariel University, Israel, and a visiting fellow at the Oxford Centre for Higher Education Policy Studies. There is a doctrine in Rabbinic and Hasidic Judaism particularly that speaks of the greatness of earlier scholars and the progressive decline of later generations. In the Talmud, it is expressed very starkly in this way, and I have Rabbi Mattuck in my thoughts as I quote this to you, so don't be too alarmed. Rabbi Zerah said that Rabbi Bar Zarmina said, if the early ones were like angels, then we are like human beings. But if the early ones were like human beings, then we, he said, are like donkeys. Not like the donkey of Rabbi Hanina ben Doza, or the donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, who were obviously rather special donkeys, but he said, like ordinary donkeys. In the medieval period, the scholars drew on an ancient idea, not expressed specifically in Jewish tradition, although it was picked up, but by John of Salisbury, that the present generation were like pygmies on the shoulders of giants. Spiritually, we are indeed like pygmies, being of inferior spiritual stature, although not wishing to diminish the breadth and depth of knowledge gained in intervening centuries. We have the vista sitting on the shoulders of the giant to look further than the giant. Mattuck was a giant in scholarship, spirituality, motivating drive to build and lead this very congregation almost from its inception until his illness and retirement. And we are indeed pygmies on his shoulders. But we also carry the tension between the wish to be true to the integrity of our founders, the wish for continuity, as well as the wish for originality and the need to address change and development in our society. It is tempting to ask, how would Mattuck have responded to our world today? What would he have had to say? Would he have modified his approach to theological questions, to observance and ethical questions, same-sex marriage, mixed-faith marriage, knowing what we know now? I hope perhaps that in Professor Alderman's interrogation, if I can put it like that, of Pam Fox about her fine study of Rabbi Dr. Israel Mattuck, some of those questions might be addressed in her responses. Please welcome Pam Fox and Professor Jeffrey Alderman.
Thank you.
You need to use the microphone.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Particularly at the back. I have to tell the Rabbi, thank her for the introductory remarks, that very early on in my academic career, when I was a humble lecturer at Royal Holloway College, as I began a lecture, one of the students at the back of the lecture hall stood up and said, "Dr. Alderman, could you speak louder? I can't hear what you're saying." At which a student at the front of the auditorium stood up and said, "I can hear what he's saying. Would you like to change places?" I reminded him, Colin, who marked the degree papers, I can tell you that. It is absolutely true that I have occasionally taken swipes at liberal Judaism, but then I've taken swipes at the disunited synagogue, the lederation of synagogues, and God help us all, the union of Orthodox Hebrew congregations. In fact, I can tell the Rabbi that the only occasion on which an organisation against which I've taken a swipe has retaliated by taking out a whole page advertisement to condemn me was actually the Federation of Synagogues, who I wrote a column about bungled Federation funerals. Since I'm going to be buried at Raynham, I don't want my funeral to be bungled. And so they had a number of, what should we call it, mishaps. They were putting a coffin in the grave and the lid fell off. Then a hearse driver thought it was the Raynham in Kent, so he was with the coffin in Kent. The mourners were by an empty graveside in Essex, calling it Essex, E-double-S-E-X. So I've asked that the hearse driver at my funeral has a sat-nav. I've also arranged for Mike Lavoyer to be with a beautiful Victorian horse-drawn hearse. All I can say is do not go on the North Circular Road or the A13 the day of my Lavoyer, because the tailback will be enormous. And we're going to have a walker in front, a man trying to look depressed as he walks from Colindale to Raynham. Well, enough about that. However, the obituary you will read of me in the Times is written by me. This is Colin, absolute God's honest truth. I occasionally am asked to write obituaries for the Times, and I certainly don't want someone, a complete stranger, writing my obituary. So the obituary you will read of me in the Times is written by me. I can give you a little taster of it. It begins with, deeply regret to announce the death of Geoffrey Alderman. Geoffrey Alderman writes. Okay. But enough of that. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is the first time that I've been in what I believe is termed the sanctuary here, though I have been in the Liberal Jewish Synagogue before. It's not my first visit to the LJS. Of course, I know David Goldberg isn't here this evening, is he? No? He and I, of course, went to the same college at Oxford, though at different years, so we're landsmen, if you like, in that respect. But this is a very important occasion. You know, publishers on the whole these days are not very enamoured with book launches. But I think they are important because they mark an important milestone in the evolution of a process of thought, a great deal of effort, and this evening is a particularly poignant book launch. Of the three M's, as it were, who were responsible for the evolution of liberal Judaism in the 20th century, two have had numerous studies of them written and researched and written of them. Claude Goldsmith Montefiore and Lily Montagu. But up till now, up to this day, we have not had anything approaching a scholarly, objective account of the third M, Isidor Mattuck. I think this is a great pity, but on the other hand, I'm absolutely delighted that a scholar like Pam Fox has been able to fill that gap for us. In a moment, I'm going to put Pam on the spot by asking her one or two very simple questions. But first, let me just set the scene. Claude Goldsmith Montefiore was a great gentleman scholar. He was responsible for bringing Solomon Schechter to this country, for example. But you wouldn't have called him, C.G. Montefiore, a person of the masses. He had a certain niche appeal. He was a philosopher, not a theologian. Lily Montagu was one of the early proponents of a certain genre, I have to be careful using this word, of feminism within Anglo Jewry. And she was, of course, the first woman to be, as it were, ordained as a Jewish cleric, Anglo-Jewish cleric in this country in 1944, I think, Pam, and she was ordained by Mattuck. It was Isidor Mattuck, this Jew who originated from Heim, Russian Lithuania, via America, who gave liberal Judaism its theology. And that is very important itself. But quite apart from the theology, Mattuck also propelled liberal Judaism from a peripheral position within Anglo-Jewry to an absolutely central position. I think that has to be stated. He was the man who launched liberal Judaism as a national, indeed international force. It's interesting to think that probably, apart from the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations, which for most of Mattuck's adult life was Joseph Herman Hertz, Mattuck was probably the most well-known Jewish cleric in Britain, apart from Hertz himself. And this was absolutely deliberate. Quite apart from giving a theological basis to liberal Judaism, Mattuck was a great publicist for liberal Judaism. Indeed, it was this activity as a publicist that caused more a controversy within Anglo-Jewry than his liberal Judaism per se. One of the interesting facts that I learned from Pam's book was that he'd actually been invited to Hertz's installation. Yeah. Of course, we are going, that would have been in when, Pam? 1913? 13. Of course, it's startling, shocking perhaps, to recall now that before the First World War, Jewish clerics of various grades of orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy were quite in the habit of swapping pulpits. Something that would be absolutely unheard of now. Simeon Singer, for example, swapped pulpit at the West London Synagogue, Reformed Synagogue. There were visits by Orthodox rabbis to non-Orthodox religious establishments. That's an age that is now almost entirely forgotten about, but it happened at that time. Mattuck launched liberal Judaism on the British stage and then on the world stage. He organised conferences up and down the land at which liberal Judaism was expounded and explained. This caused a lot of friction within Anglo-Jewry. He was accused of upsetting a particular apple cart. He didn't pay much attention to that. He was, of course I never knew him, but he was by all accounts an extremely charming person who could also be very ruthless in debate. And that's the first question, Pam, I'm going to ask you. I'm not going to ask you to begin with why you wrote the book, but I'll come on to that in a moment. Tell us something about the personality of Mattuck. Is there anybody here who ever knew him? There must be a few. So, you know, I like these launches to be interactive, and that people don't feel reticent about talking, about speaking out, and hearing your views. What sort of a man was Mattuck?
He was absolutely fascinating. What was interesting about the book is that when I set out, the only information that was available about Mattuck tended to give the impression that he was a complete paragon, that he was a deeply intelligent man. He was the only person that possibly had been appointed at the LJS. He got on very well with everybody. Everybody adored him. His career was without blemish, and he died a fulfilled man. As soon as I started to research the book, it immediately became evident that he was not that paragon at all. He did have his quirks, he did have his foibles, but actually I liked him all the more for that. He became much more rounded, a much more human kind of figure as I got to know Mattuck, the person. He was wonderful in very many ways, and people who knew he might want to add to it, not least of which was his ability to talk, particularly to preach and to give addresses. But he was also quite uncompromising as well. If he got an idea, he pursued it to the absolute limits. He was tenacious, almost to the point of obstinacy. He was a very, very kind man. He was a very amusing man. Apparently he was always being invited out to dinner because he had an endless fund of anecdotes. But he was also quite a private man as well. As much as he entertained and liked being entertained, he also liked to protect his private space. He was very, very, very fond of his family, his wife and his children, and he always made time to be with them as well. So all of that I describe in detail at the book. It might be good, Geoffrey, to hear from just one or two people.
Yes.
I mean, for example, in the audience we have Ruth Ive, who was a young person when Mattuck was first came to the country. And indeed, Ruth, am I not right in thinking that you used to be what was called a runner at his Sunday services, when you used to take questions up to Dr. Mattuck for him to answer?
Well, I knew Dr. Mattuck really since I was about 17. And I came to London then, and I couldn't be confirmed because I was a month too old. And he said I'd have to wait a whole year before I could be confirmed. And I'm afraid to say I didn't bother. He was a lovely man. He was a great friend of our family. Mrs. Mattuck and my mother were great friends, and Dorothy, his daughter, Dorothy Edgar, was also a very dear friend. I don't know whether I'm going to be irreverent, but he really was a groundbreaker, in as much as the circumstances before the war were really quite different. Most Jewish young people worked a 5.5 years and could never come to service or synagogue. So he organised on Sunday mornings a service, wouldn't describe service, with I'm a real member, and he would discuss relevant questions on morals and everything else that went with it of the day. And on those days, times, we were on speaking terms with the Jewish Chronicle, and we advertised these talks and sermons, and they really were very well attended by a very large audience. The alumni, the young people, were organised into being brothers, and we had to sit either side of the and we had to take the messages backwards and forwards from the speaker to Dr. Mattuck, and he answered questions on everything, absolutely everything. And I remember vividly, and I'm sure everybody else does too, but one Sunday, it was advertised, he was going to talk about SEX, and it was called. backwards and forwards up the old synagogue with little bits of paper, their messages, and he answered them very frankly, very openly. He really was. He was a wonderful man. He was an innovator. He was very involved in the affairs of Judaism, and he passed it on to us, no doubt about it. He was a great influence in my life. He also married me, so he really was a great influence.
Thank you very
I'm
much.
looking forward to reading Pam's book of words and see if she realised what a great man he was.
Thank you. Pam, we have to talk about this. He was an inveterate anti-Zionist to his dying day. Could you explain in what was his why was he such an inveterate anti-Zionist?
That's a very interesting question. Looking back over his history, it's very apparent that his anti-Zionism stemmed probably from Lithuania. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Oh, right, got it. His earliest writings and his earliest correspondence suggest that it stemmed way back to his early childhood. So that's an interesting piece of information. The village from which he came from in Lithuania, I discovered was one which was split asunder in half about the issue of Zionism. And my suspicion even is that the family left Lithuania because of that particular issue. So he was quite a sort of a long-standing anti-Zionist. Another thing to remark is that he became more anti-Zionist as time progressed. I think when he first came to England, he often referred to himself not as an anti-Zionist, but as a non-Zionist. He said that he was not a supporter of Israel, but he wasn't particularly involved in any organised movements against it. He saw himself as being on the sidelines. However, the situation dramatically changed post the Second World War, when it became much more evident that Israel was going to become a state. And then I would say that he very, very quickly changed from being non-Zionist to being a Zionist, and he did become very much part of a political organisation, what was called the Jewish Fellowship. And his writings at that time were very stringent, were very strident, and actually did little to enhance his reputation, because by then he was very much out of step with a lot of Anglo Jewry, in fact, international Jewry.
Yes, I think we ought to. This is an important part of Mattuck's whole character. We ought to place this in a context which is often forgotten about nowadays. Namely, that there was a time when anti-Zionism was, dare I use this word, fashionable within Anglo Jewry. We forget that now. A newspaper contacted me a few days ago about the possibility of a motion of no confidence being lodged at the Board of Deputies of some British Jews against the present president. Actually, that motion has been ruled out of order, I can tell you that today. But I had to remind this budding newspaper reporter that the only occasion on which a president of the Board of Deputies has been forced out of office was over Zionism, at least in part in 1917, when the then president, a very well-known barrister, David Lindo Alexander, was forced to resign after he and Claude Goldsmith Montefiore had co-signed a letter to the Times denouncing in advance, as it were, the Balfour Declaration. Claude Montefiore signed it as president of the Anglo-Jewish Association, and he didn't need to get anyone's permission to do that. David Lindo Alexander signed it as president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, They hadn't got the permission of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and actually he was forced out more on that issue, Colin, yes, than over his Zionism, that he was forced out because he had, euphemistically speaking, stuck two fingers up at the rank and file of the deputies rather than the issue of Zionism per se. We forget now that when the Zionist movement arose in this country, there were many men and women who could remember the days before full political emancipation for British Jewry. And they were seriously worried that if a Jewish state was established, it didn't much matter at that time where it was established. Of course, there were quite a few schemes apart from the Palestinian scheme, that they would be told by British anti-alienists, well, you've got a country of your own, so get out of here and go to that country then. This was a genuine fear, and it arose. It was more strident, this fear, after the promulgation of the Balfour Declaration and after the granting of the Palestine Mandate than beforehand. There were many, I use this word deliberately, many prominent British Jews who were not merely non-Zionists, they were anti-Zionist. And so we need to put that aspect of Mattuck's career in that context, that he was part of a movement at that time. And I don't think is much point or mileage in moralising about this. It was the anti-Zionism was, if anything, more deeply embedded in the Orthodox camp than in the liberal camp, much more so. And the Agudas Yisrael movement split over the issue eventually. In the late 1930s, Agudas Yisrael, given the situation with Nazism, became sort of reconciled to building a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but that wasn't going to be, if they could help it, a nation state. A minority of Agudas Yisrael said absolutely not, and walked out of Agudas Yisrael to form the Torah Carta movement. Anyway, I think, Pam, that's worth emphasising, that Mattuck wasn't alone here, he wasn't idiosyncratic. His opposition to Zionism would have been completely understood and sympathised with by large swathes of opinion within British Jewry. What was his theological contribution to liberal Judaism?
I think it's fair to say that when he arrived in the country, the movement was barely starting blocks. Lily Montague and Lord Montefiore, Israel Abrahams, had made very, very brave moves in establishing the Jewish Religious Union and the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, but there was barely a congregation when he arrived, and he then did everything to make liberal Judaism happen in practice. All the signs were it might not have continued for much longer had he not arrived. He organised synagogue life, for example. He set up a cemetery, he organised marriages, he provided it with a liturgy, he organised forms of worship, etc. One of his very, very first tasks was to organise the religion school, which was attended both by members and the children of members and non-members, and for many years was the kind of the prime activity of the synagogue. He then turned his attention to young people. And this was a way of making the movement sustainable, because he was about recruiting the next generation, both young people and the future leaders as well. He also, I think, as you alluded to in the very beginning, gave the movement a great deal of prominence. He was barely out of the press. not just the Jewish press, but the non-Jewish press.
Very,
as well.
very important. More important was his relationship with the non-Jewish press than with the Jewish. This was taking the fight outside Anglo-Jewry, highly controversial at the time, but he was very good at it. He was very good at networking. Sorry, Pam, I've interrupted you, but I think that point is worth it. Wasn't he? He was good networker.
And perhaps the thing that we take for granted these days is one of the other most brave things he did was to start interfaith dialogue. When he arrived in the country, this was almost unthinkable. But within just a few years of being here, he was making the first overtures into talking to Christian clerics. It wasn't put on an organised basis, mainly because of the intervention of the First World War. But by the middle of the 1920s, there was an organised society of Jews and Christians, and Mattuck was one of the co-chairs of that. He was not popular in some quarters because of the interfaith dialogue, but actually his groundbreaking activities then later on became the model for the National Society of Christians and Jews. And I think that above all, this is one of the things that he might be remembered for, his interfaith activities.
Can I just go, thank you for that. Can I just go back a stage to focus on Pam's remarks a few moments ago about the theological and organisational underpinning that Mattuck gave to liberal Judaism. And again here, it's vital that everyone sees this in context. When the Jewish Religious Union came on the scene in the early years of the 20th century, non-Orthodox Judaism in any organised sense in this country was on its last legs. The West London Synagogue of British Jews, the first Reformed synagogue, had declined in several respects. It was, by all accounts of those who visited the synagogue, frequented largely by ageing women. I hope that women amongst you will not hold that against me. I'm just reporting what we know. It had failed to recruit new members. It had failed to develop a systematic, I'll call it reform theology. And in fact, many observers said there was little difference, if any, between going into the West London Synagogue and going into the new synagogue, the new West End Synagogue, St Petersburg Place, or the Hampstead United Synagogue. Very little difference. It was on its last legs, hugely declining membership and no theology to speak of. After David Wolfe Marks, the first rabbi of the Berkeley Street place of worship, as Moses Montefiore called it, there was no theologian within the reform movement in this country who could carry that theology forward. And it was into that milieu, into that void, if you like, that Mattuck stepped. So that by the end of the 1920s, if not earlier, the membership of the LJS was far in excess of the membership of the West London Reformed Synagogue. I see one or two of you in the audience grimacing and expressing surprise. That is a fact. We know that. We know from the membership statistics. And that was Mattuck's doing. It certainly wasn't Claude Goldsmith Montefiore's doing. That was Mattuck's doing. Pam, how did he attract members? Was it that the members were attracted to him? Was it to the feminist slant within liberal Judaism? What drove some Jews in this country to leave orthodoxy, as Mattuck himself had done, I suppose, I ought to say, and go over to liberal Judaism?
Okay, Okay, it's quite a complicated answer because there was no one reason. People came for lots of different reasons, but all of them stem back to Mattuck. Some came for the religion school education, which I previously mentioned. Some came for the music, which he organised. Some came just to hear him speak. Some came because of his high public profile. Some came because of the emphasis that he placed on ethics and social responsibility. So what you got after he'd been here for 10 years, say, is a much greater cross-section of people in the congregation than there had been when he arrived. To be fair, when he arrived, a lot of the people who were members of the synagogue were in one way or another related to Lily Montague or to Montefiore. Either they were friends or relations. Within 10 years, people were here from a much broader spectrum of life and for lots more reasons than they related to Lily Montague.
What would have been the attraction for young people to join the LJS?
I think, actually, Ruth put her finger on it, because he was brave and courageous and spoke out and actually didn't mind what he said, really. The young people were really attracted by this. His Sunday services brought in audiences of about 1,000 people, which
just remark that.
Which were absolutely unparalleled at the time. There was nothing like them in the country. And those Sunday services put him on a par with the biggies in America, the giants, like Stephen Wise in New York, and Emil Hirsch in Chicago. They got audiences like that, but he was paralleling those in London. And a lot of those people who came to the Sunday services were young people who came because he was daring and because he was outspoken.
Could you give us an idea of some of the issues on which he was outspoken?
Sure. They ranged from what I'd call moral issues of the day, such as he talked about abortion, he talked about family planning, he talked about euthanasia, he talked about current literature of the day. Into the 1930s, when actually the Sunday services reached their heights, he talked about all of the big issues which were facing Anglo-Jewry at the time, what was happening in Germany, what was happening in Russia, what was happening with communism, what was happening in the East End of London, when other parts of Anglo-Jewry were afraid to mention these things because of fears of backlash. Mattuck was talking about them, and the Liberal Jewish synagogue was one of the few places that young people could come and hear about these issues. And the other thing perhaps I ought to mention is amongst those 1,000 people who came to the Liberal Jewish synagogue, a lot of them were non-Jews. Non-Jewish people came to hear Mattuck talk.
You wouldn't have had that of any other rabbinical figure in Anglo-Jewry at that time. It's just inconceivable. And you wouldn't have got any Anglo-Jewish cleric apart from Mattuck and possibly one or two idiosyncratic persons talking about family planning or abortion. Although, of course, these issues were very much talked about in the 1920s and 1930s, but not, apart from Mattuck, within the circles of Anglo-Jewry. He touched the parts, in other words, ladies and gentlemen, that other Anglo-Jewish clerics simply dare not touch, or perhaps were incapable of touching or talking about. So we begin now, certainly I do after having heard Pam and read the book, we begin to get a little more rounded picture of why Mattuck was so important. Could you just name us one ethical issue apart from sex and family planning that he talked about?
That's what I've mentioned, and it's But what mattered was that he's strongest and he's most articulate when he was talking about political issues of the day. He was, I think, either the most or one of the most leftward-leaning clerics of the day. He was very much supportive of the working man, and a lot of his sermons and a lot of his Sunday addresses related to a lot of the industrial disputes that were going on during the 90s and 20s. He talked a lot about the depression in the 1930s, and it's interesting to note that his sermons, which he continued and which became nonetheless honest and candid, brought him into dispute and argument with the LJS congregation. There were many a member of the synagogue who didn't like what he said. And indeed, on certain occasions, he even had big fallings out with Claude Montefiore himself, who was generally one of Mattuck's biggest backers.
Because he talked about unemployment and...
He referred to the general strike as a lockout, which didn't go down well.
Just before I know, a gentleman at the back has asked to speak, and we're very happy to. Just before I ask this gentleman to speak, let me also place that in context. Before the First World War, it was absolutely normal for rabbis and ministers of religion in British Jewry to take political positions. Absolutely normal. Simeon Singer, for example, was a prison chaplain and prison visitor and gave some very outspoken sermons in the latter decades of the 19th century on sweated labour, the sweatshops. Herman Adler was a rank Tory. He was a delegate chief rabbi from 1879 and chief rabbi in his own right from 1891 to his death in 1911. Herman Adler famously on one occasion refused to meet a deputation of the Jewish workers led by the famous Jewish East End trade unionist Louis Lyons. Absolutely refused to meet them. He refused to condemn sweatshop conditions in the East End of London, but Simeon Singer didn't. During the Boer War, Herman Adler was absolutely outspoken in his support of the government of the third Marquess of Salisbury and supported the British in their war against the Dutch settlers in South Africa. And during the January 1906 general election, Herman Adler all but campaigned for a Tory victory, which he didn't get, in that election. And if you look at Jewish newspapers of the period, both English and Yiddish newspapers, you'll see many advertisements saying this rabbi backs this particular parliamentary candidate or that particular parliamentary candidate. After the First World War, this became increasingly unfashionable. But Mattuck was never one to be bothered by what was fashionable. I think that's absolutely right. And he felt that unemployment, particularly amongst the miners, was something that he felt that if Judaism had nothing to say about these social issues, then you might as well give up. That was really his view. Interestingly, the events that led to the ousting of Louis Montagu, the second Baron Swathling, as president of the Federation of Synagogues in the early 1920s, also had to do with this type of issue. The rank and file in the East End of London wanted the Federation of Synagogues to take these sorts of positions, to do something about unemployment, to support miners and so on and so forth. Of course, Louis Montagu was having none of this, and the rank and file found a spokesperson, a very colourful, although I have to say rather unsavoury character, who became the third president, Maury Davis. Davis could speak fluent Yiddish and got a resolution passed at the Federation that any person who wanted to speak Yiddish at the council was able to do so. Louis Montagu couldn't understand a word of Yiddish, so therefore his presidency was at an end. I'm not sure, Pam, well, I turn to you, whether Davis and Mattuck ever met. Did they ever meet, to the best of your knowledge?
I'm not aware of it.
I'm not, although, of course, we know that they inhabited the same forums to some extent. Davis was... The Federation gave grants to starving mining families in South Wales. They gave donations for overtly political purposes. This was what the rank and file of the poor in London Jewry wanted. They wanted their Judaism to take a position on these issues. And now I think you begin to, certainly I begin to understand why Mattuck was so popular and why he could draw these large crowds, because he was addressing the sorts of issues that the rank and file in Anglo Jewry wanted to have discussed, and they couldn't in the big cathedral synagogues of the United Synagogue or its paradigms in the provinces. Why was the leadership of the LJS opposed to this? Was it political, or did they think this is not something a rabbi should talk about?
Court Montefiore thought that these were things that a rabbi shouldn't speak about. Others felt that he was actually criticising them in the way they lived their life, either explicitly or implicitly, when he talked about the attitude of rich people towards poor people. He was criticising many of the members of the liberal Jewish synagogue. And I think that a lot of people felt that he was undermining the position that they gained in British society by being so outspoken.
The gentleman there wanted to make an intervention.
Family interest, I'm afraid. I don't think you can hear me through this, so I'll speak up a little bit louder. You describe a lot of his secular activities and social activities, and almost portraying the development of the LDS as sort of a personality cult. But you've also alluded to a development of a new liturgy. And I just wonder whether some of the new members of the LDS were drawn by the offer of a different type of Judaism, and what did Mattuck, how did he develop the Jewish aspects of the synagogue?
Okay.
I think there's probably a generational thing there, because I think the initial members of the LJS were not very religious. They were quite secular, actually. But I think that as he became more established, as he started teaching in the religious school, as he started to give sermons and things, he did start to cultivate a following, which was more of a religious following. But the interesting thing that I chart through the book is there was almost a rise and fall of that religion, if you like, because to begin with, people were very behind Mattuck and the things that he stood for and the things that he preached, etc. But Mattuck actually failed to move on. As he grew older, he almost became entrenched in his religious outlook, and he started to lose people. So there was almost that kind of curve, if you like, in support for Mattuck's theology.
Thanks very much. He was active, wasn't he, Pam, almost to the end? Yes?
Yes, he actually changed what he did. In his first decade or so, he was very much concentrating on developing the congregation. He then moved outwards from the congregation to put a lot more emphasis on developing other communities. He then started to work on a national stage and even internationally, being one of the instigators of the World Union of Progressive Judaism. And then post-World War, you start to see him change emphasis again, when he's very much more moving away from the congregation and almost warning people about some of the fears that he had about developing life, not just Israel, but developing political totalitarian movements and so on. And then in the very, very last few years of his life, his emphasis was very much on scholarship, Jewish scholarship. So there were different phases of his life.
I have to lay bare a secret here. I read this book in manuscript, yes? And I was at that time revising my own work on British Jewry since emancipation. And as luck or the Almighty would have it, I was dealing with the origins of liberal Judaism, and I knew that there was someone I'd heard was writing a biography of Mattuck. And I thought I must try and track down this person. But I had then started to develop problems with my artificial hip. Those of you who are taxpayers, it's been provided by the National Health Service, so thank you very much for that. And then through a third party, Pam got in touch with me. And I felt privileged to be able to read the book in typescript, I shouldn't say manuscript, typescript, because I don't think, Pam, that my own remarks, such as they are, about the origins and the development of liberal Judaism would have been anywhere near as complete as they are now, had it not been for the fact that you allowed me to read this your book in typescript. I was absolutely enthralled by it. I read it over a weekend, and you know, biography is a very, ladies and gentlemen, is a very, very specialised branch of history. There are historians and there are biographers. I'm a historian, not a biographer. But Pam has shown in this book how you can write an entertaining biography, which is also a historical statement. And I think that's an enormous achievement, because, as she has implied earlier on, there are so many books about rabbis that are simply hagiographies, particularly of the Colin of the art scroll genre. It's a sort of a template. You know, a child is born. They're a Talmudic genius at the age of 2. then they go to yeshiva. Then an Ilui, and then a comely, modest maiden is found for them, and they have many children, and the rabbi develops a court following, and so on. This is in a completely different genre. It is both biography and history. I'm not sure that I could ever contemplate writing such a book. I am writing my memoirs at the moment. It's called A Better Class of Enemy. After my first year on the Senate at London University, the then Vice-Chancellor said to me, "Geoffrey, have you made many friends on the Senate?" I said, "No, Vice-Chancellor, I've certainly made a better class of enemy." But that's autobiography. By the way, you'll have to wait for my demise in order to read that. I think, apart from anything else, that Pam Fox's biography of Israel, Isidor Mattuck, shows us what a critical biography should do. And actually, I think Mattuck himself as a person gains by that. He gains by the story being told, warts and all, the strengths and weaknesses. For are we not all human? Are we all not the children of God? I want to thank Pam very much for having undertaken this. I can't imagine undertaking such a thing. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the Liberal Jewish Synagogue for hosting this event and for having had the temerity to invite me along. And I hope you will show your appreciation of Pam in the usual manner. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I just wear my chairman's hat for a moment and give one or two thank yous. Firstly to Professor Alderman. As Alex said at the beginning, Rabbi Wright said at the beginning, we are absolutely delighted and honoured that Professor Alderman has been with us this evening, someone of his calibre, to share this launch today. We are absolutely delighted he's with us, particularly as there were 3 challenges to him being here this evening. The first one, as he mentioned, was that he himself was writing a book, and we can give a little plug for that this evening. I hope people will read that. I know Pam's been reading it recently. The second challenge was that he had a hip operation. I think there must be something about operations at the moment, but he had an operation and is obviously recovering from that. And the third that he hasn't managed to mention this evening, but I'm sure we'll want to share our joy with him, that he's recently become a grandfather. He has a new granddaughter, Devorah, and we send him our best wishes and congratulations on that. But all of those 3 things have happened recently for Professor Alderman, and still he is with us this evening, and we're absolutely delighted by that. Particularly looking round the congregation, or those who are here this evening, I noticed that we have members here of the Federation, of the United Synagogue, of Masorti, of the Reform Movement, of Liberal Judaism, and probably from others that I haven't included. And I think Mattuck, Dr. Mattuck would have been delighted that we have such a mixture here this evening in this community. Secondly, of course, turning partly with my chairman's hat, but also with my husband's hat on, I obviously want to thank Pam for all her contributions to this evening. The depth of research and her analysis is certainly there as you read the book, but in what we've heard from her this evening. I thought this evening that I probably didn't have anything in common with Claude Montefiore. That's not a slip of tongue, with Claude Montefiore. But in fact, I've realised that perhaps I did have something in common, because Claude Montefiore went to America to find Rabbi Mattuck over 100 years ago. I went to America and found the biographer of Mattuck about 10 years ago. But that was something I had in common. Pam, of course, has been back to America since then and has had quite a lot of contact with the Mattuck family, and that's been a major contribution to this book that hasn't, I think, got mentioned this evening, but is a real major significant contribution. And in fact, I will say to you that it's because of a generous donation from the Mattuck family that we've been able to offer some of these books at a rather reduced price this evening compared with what they will be available when they are now on the market, but they're at a slightly cheaper rate to you because of a generous donation from the Mattuck family. And I thought I might just share with you that we nearly had Rabbi Mattuck's grandson with us here this evening. That's Robert Edgar, who had hoped to be here but wasn't able to be at the last moment. And he wrote a message to Pam saying, "I'm afraid that despite our best efforts, we'll be unable to get to London on Wednesday." But he said the whole family are delighted, very proud that you've produced this biography of Grandpa. I hope that the readers of the book will consider how things now compare with his vision of the LJS, the LJ movement, Israel, etc. If he was able to peer out from his burial plot, which is in the LJS cemetery in Wilston, I do wonder how he would feel about the world he would see around him, both near and far. Well, I think perhaps if you read the book, you may get a flavour of that. I know that Pam has spent thousands, literally thousands of hours, researching, bringing alive the life of Dr. Mattuck. Some of you won't realise one of the acknowledgements that isn't in there that probably should have been included. Pam's going to give me funny looks now, I think, but she should, I think, probably have thanked the Golders Green Library, where she disappeared on many occasions, spending many hundreds of hours doing not just her research, but the follow-up work to actually turn the original manuscript typescript into the book that we see here in front of us. One of the troubles with going to Golders Green Library, wonderful though it may be, is that whenever I visited her while she was working on the book, there seemed to be the children's group going on at one side of the library, singing about the wheels on the bus go round and round, the wheels on the bus go round and round. But it does seem to me that 100 years on, Rabbi Mattuck has come round and round, and I hope that many of you will read the book, will buy copies of the book. They are available if you want Pam to sign them afterwards, and please do have the refreshments that are still available. More books are available, and again, let's give our appreciation to both Professor Alderman and to Pam.